Edward Harrington had always lived a life that most people could only dream of. The Harrington estate, a sprawling mansion surrounded by acres of lush gardens and orchards, was a symbol of wealth, power, and social prestige. Edward, as the only son of the Harrington family, had grown up in luxury. Tutors had taught him everything from classical literature to fencing, and servants had been at his beck and call since he could walk. But despite the comfort and privilege, Edward had a restless spirit. He was clever, yes, but also reckless, impulsive, and eager to challenge boundaries simply because he could. In the past, his father, Lord Benjamin Harrington, had tolerated his son's antics. Edward had embarrassed the family on several occasions, from throwing lavish parties that annoyed neighbors to gambling away small fortunes without thought. His mother, Lady Eleanor Harrington, often whispered to the housekeeper that Edward was a storm disguised as a boy. Yet everyone believed that the boy would eventually learn to be responsible. Unfortunately, Edward was stubborn, proud, and utterly convinced that the world should bend to his desires. The turning point came one crisp autumn evening during the Harrington family's annual society gathering. The event was the highlight of the season, with the town's elite dressed in their finest attire and eager to see the family's opulent displays. Guests admired the sparkling chandeliers, the polished marble floors, and the orchestra playing softly in the background. Edward, as always, wanted to be the center of attention. But this time, he went too far. He had promised to organize a surprise for the guests, a stunt involving fireworks, an idea he had seen in a far-off city and thought would make him legendary. But Edward, impatient and careless, ignored the advice of the older staff and the safety measures he had been taught. The result was chaos. One of the fireworks misfired, startling the crowd and causing a small fire near the garden pavilion. Guests screamed and ran in panic, while servants rushed to douse the flames. Though no one was seriously hurt, the embarrassment to the Harrington family was immense. Lord Harrington, who had tolerated Edward's antics for years, finally reached his limit. He was a stern man, not given to public displays of emotion. But that evening, his face was as red with anger as Edward's mismanaged fireworks had left the garden. He called Edward into the study, a grand room lined with dark oak shelves filled with leather-bound books, and closed the door. The conversation was long and measured, with Edward initially trying to charm his way out of the punishment, boasting about how his stunt had impressed some of the younger guests. But Lord Harrington would hear none of it. "Edward," he said, his voice steady but firm, "you have humiliated this family more than I can tolerate. You treat our name and our home as if they are toys. I will not allow it to continue. You need to understand responsibility, humility, and respect, and you will learn it in a way that you cannot ignore." Edward scoffed. "Father, I don't—" "You will marry Margaret Thompson," Lord Harrington interrupted, his eyes piercing. "You will live with her, learn from her, and carry out your life in partnership with her. She is a servant in this house, humble in every way. And you, Edward, will learn what it means to honor and respect another human being who is not beneath you in value, but only in station. Consider this punishment, but also a lesson that I hope will last a lifetime." Edward froze. Margaret Thompson. He knew her well. She had been a servant at Harrington Estate for years, quiet, efficient, and entirely unremarkable to the world, except in Edward's life. She was the daughter of a widow who had worked for his family since Edward was a child. Margaret was diligent, discreet, and entirely devoted to the household. Edward had never thought of her in any other way than as someone who polished floors, served tea, and whispered reminders about chores to him when he forgot. "Father, you can't be serious," Edward stammered. "You can't expect me to marry a servant. Everyone will mock me. The town, my friends. My decision is final," Lord Harrington said. "You have humiliated this family publicly, and now you will learn humility privately. You will marry Margaret Thompson in 3 months' time. And Edward, if you think of disobeying me, remember that the Harrington fortune will not protect you from the consequences. Edward left the study that evening in a state of disbelief. He wandered through the gardens, where the smell of autumn leaves and the cool breeze did little to calm his storming mind. How could his father possibly think this would teach him anything? How could anyone take this seriously? The very idea felt like a public execution of his pride. Edward's friends, once amused by his adventures, would surely laugh cruelly when they heard the news. He imagined the whispers, the shocked faces, the ridicule, and the fury inside him only grew. Meanwhile, Margaret Thompson, unaware of the decision that would change her life, went about her duties as usual. She polished the silver, prepared the evening meal, and tended to the minor crises of the household with her usual calm efficiency. To her, life was a series of tasks to be completed with care and patience. And the Harrington family's dramas were nothing new. Little did she know that the young master she had quietly observed and occasionally corrected for years would soon become her husband. When the announcement was finally made, the reaction from the household staff was mixed. Some whispered in disbelief, wondering how the proud Edward Harrington could be forced into such a match. Others, more sympathetic, nodded quietly, realizing that this might be the only way to teach him discipline and empathy. Edward himself refused to speak to Margaret for days, believing that she would relish his humiliation. But Margaret, as ever, remained polite and professional, bowing and offering her usual calm smile without comment. The town's reaction, when the news leaked, was even more dramatic. Rumors spread quickly, and neighbors speculated on the terrible fate of the young heir. Gentlewomen and merchants alike whispered about how Edward's life had taken a turn for the worse. Some felt sorry for him. Others secretly delighted in what they perceived as his comeuppance. Edward, though furious, could not escape the growing reality. In a few months, he would be legally bound to someone he had never considered his equal. As the days passed, Edward began to feel a strange mix of emotions. Anger and humiliation were still at the forefront, but beneath them lurked curiosity. Margaret, though a servant, had always been capable, smart, and calm in ways that he had never fully appreciated. He recalled small moments from his childhood. The time she had quietly fixed a problem in the garden before anyone noticed. The way she had managed household affairs when his parents were away. The gentle way she had spoken to his younger siblings. Perhaps, he begrudgingly admitted, there might be more to Margaret than he had ever imagined. Edward's friends, when they heard the news, tried to console him in their own ways. "It's not so bad, Ed," one of them said, laughing. "You might find it interesting." Another added, "At least she's nice. You won't starve, that's for sure." But Edward's pride was wounded, and he refused to see any humor in the situation. For him, this was punishment, pure and simple. Yet, as the wedding day approached, Edward found that the more he thought about Margaret, the more his curiosity grew. How would she handle him? How would she respond to someone who was arrogant, spoiled, and convinced of his superiority? Would she resent him? Would she challenge him in ways he had never experienced? These questions, which he did not admit even to himself, planted a small seed of unease and perhaps, just perhaps, the faintest hint of anticipation. The night before the wedding, Edward walked alone through the estate gardens, watching the moonlight reflect off the fountains and statues. He felt the weight of his father's words, the judgment of society, and the strange uncertainty of the life that awaited him. For the first time, Edward realized that his life was about to change in ways he could not control. He had been punished, yes. But more than that, he had been given a challenge, one that might demand more than his cleverness, his charm, or his wealth. It might demand something he had never truly learned: respect, patience, and the willingness to see another human being as equal, no matter their station. And so, Edward Harrington, proud, reckless, and unprepared, faced a future that promised humiliation, curiosity, and perhaps an unexpected lesson in the truest sense of the word. Little did he know, the punishment his father had imposed would not only test his pride, but would also change the course of his life forever. The morning after the wedding, Edward awoke in a room that felt strangely unfamiliar. It was no longer the grand suite he had always taken for granted, where every detail catered to his comfort and whims. This room, while clean and orderly, had a simplicity he had never experienced. The bed was modest, the curtains plain, and the only decorations were a few small paintings on the walls. Edward sat up, feeling an unusual weight in his chest, a mixture of resentment, confusion, and an unspoken curiosity about the life that lay ahead. Margaret Thompson had already begun her day. She moved quietly through the halls of the Harrington estate, her steps measured and calm. Unlike Edward, she had always understood her responsibilities clearly. She ensured that the household ran smoothly, and now, as the young master's wife, she carried a new responsibility, managing the delicate balance between her duties and her role as Edward's partner. She did not allow herself to feel triumphant or vindicated, despite knowing the town would gossip endlessly about the unusual union. To Margaret, life was about steady work, careful observation, and gentle influence, not drama or spectacle. When Edward finally came down for breakfast, he found Margaret already seated at the table. She had prepared the meal herself, as she had for countless others in the family before him. The table was neatly arranged, the food simple but nourishing, and the room smelled of fresh bread and brewed tea. Edward stared at her for a moment, unsure how to act. Should he sulk? Should he demand that servants attend to him? Or should he speak politely, though he felt no inclination to do so? "Good morning, Edward," Margaret said, her voice calm and steady. There was no hint of mockery, no satisfaction in his discomfort, only quiet acknowledgement. "Breakfast is ready. I hope you slept well." Edward, unused to being addressed in this way by someone he had always seen as a servant, felt a strange tension. He cleared his throat. "Good morning," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. He sat down heavily, feeling the rigid formality of the moment press down on him. He was, in truth, both humiliated and irritated. Every polite smile she offered seemed like a silent reminder that he was no longer entirely in control of his life. As the days passed, life in the Harrington estate began to shift in ways Edward had never expected. Margaret took on her new role without fuss or fanfare. She did not try to dominate him or belittle him, as he had secretly feared. Instead, she worked alongside him, quietly setting boundaries and guiding him through the routines of the household. At first, Edward resisted. He would dismiss her suggestions, complain about the tasks she asked him to perform, and retreat into his own pride. But Margaret, patient and consistent, refused to be drawn into arguments. The townspeople, meanwhile, watched with fascination. Gossip traveled quickly, and no one could quite believe that Edward Harrington, the reckless young heir, was living with a servant as his wife. Some neighbors scoffed, predicting disaster. Others secretly admired Margaret's composure, whispering that she might be the one to tame Edward's wild spirit. Edward himself tried to ignore the rumors, though each passing day made it increasingly clear that the world was watching his every move. Despite his resistance, Edward began to notice small, subtle things about Margaret. She had a way of organizing the household that made everything run smoothly. When she spoke, people listened, not because she demanded it, but because her words carried clarity and quiet authority. She had a sharp mind and a remarkable memory for details, able to recall conversations, schedules, and small tasks without effort. Slowly, Edward began to realize that her intelligence was something he had never truly appreciated before. One afternoon, as Edward wandered through the library, he found Margaret carefully arranging books that had been misplaced during a cleaning. She looked up and smiled softly. as if noticing him for the first time in a new light. "You should be careful with these," she said, pointing to a collection of rare manuscripts. "They are delicate and valuable." Edward frowned, feeling a mixture of irritation and curiosity. Margaret's smile did not falter. "I only wanted to remind you. It is easy to forget when one is preoccupied with other matters." Her words struck him in a way he could not explain. It was not the reminder itself, but the manner in which it was delivered, calm, respectful, yet firm. Edward felt a strange awareness that Margaret had insight he lacked. And for the first time, he wondered if perhaps there was more to her than he had ever considered. Their days settled into a rhythm. Edward began to participate in household chores reluctantly, at first, and later, with a growing sense of understanding. He learned how to manage small tasks, to take responsibility for his actions, and to consider the perspectives of others. Margaret did not lecture him or scold him. She simply demonstrated what could be done and allowed him to observe and learn. Gradually, Edward found that he was not entirely miserable. In fact, he began to enjoy moments of quiet collaboration, where he could see the results of careful work and planning. One evening, the estate faced an unexpected challenge. A sudden storm swept through the region, bringing heavy rain and strong winds. Trees were uprooted, and part of the garden wall collapsed. Edward watched in horror as the estate's carefully maintained grounds were damaged. For a moment, he panicked, imagining how his father would react and how the townspeople would gloat over the misfortune. Margaret, however, remained calm. She organized the staff, directed repairs, and ensured that everyone worked safely and efficiently. Edward, initially uncertain and frustrated, found himself drawn into the process. He lifted, carried, and repaired alongside the staff, guided by Margaret's steady hand and clear instructions. By the end of the evening, the immediate danger had passed, and the estate was largely intact. Edward felt exhaustion, but also an unexpected sense of pride. He had contributed, he had helped, and he had survived without causing further chaos. It was during moments like these that Edward began to see Margaret in a new light. She was not simply a servant, nor was she merely a quiet presence in the household. She was intelligent, capable, and courageous, qualities that he had long admired in stories of great leaders and heroes. And now, he was seeing them in someone he had once considered beneath him. Margaret, for her part, noticed the small changes in Edward as well. He still had moments of pride and stubbornness, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor. He asked questions, listened to suggestions, and occasionally even admitted that he did not know the answer. She did not comment on these changes overtly. She simply allowed them to happen naturally, believing that true growth could not be forced. As the weeks turned into months, the household began to operate more smoothly than ever before. Edward, once a source of disruption and frustration, became a responsible participant in daily life. The servants, initially wary and uncertain, began to respect him in a new way, not out of fear or obligation, but because they could see his genuine effort to contribute and learn. Margaret, quietly proud, continued her work without seeking recognition, knowing that her influence was having an impact that would last a lifetime. One afternoon, Edward found himself alone with Margaret in the garden. The autumn sun filtered through the trees, casting a warm glow over the estate. Edward, who had rarely spent time reflecting quietly in nature, felt a moment of calm he had never experienced before. He turned to Margaret, noticing the way her eyes reflected both intelligence and kindness. You have taught me more than I expected," Edward said, his voice quieter than usual. "I thought this arrangement would be unbearable, but I've learned things I never thought I would." Margaret looked at him calmly, her expression unreadable. "I only guided you, Edward," The learning comes from your willingness to see and understand. That is something no one can do for another. Edward paused, considering her words. For the first time, he felt a sense of humility, not forced, not bitter, but genuine. He realized that his father's punishment, as humiliating as it had seemed, was also an opportunity. He had been given a chance to grow, to change, and to recognize the value in someone he had once dismissed. In the following weeks, Edward continued to change in small ways that he himself barely noticed. He became more patient with the staff, more considerate in his interactions, and more aware of the consequences of his actions. Margaret, observing these shifts, felt a quiet satisfaction, not because she had won or proven a point, but because Edward was slowly becoming the man he had the potential to be. The townspeople, ever curious, began to notice the change as well. Edward Harrington, once the reckless young heir, was no longer the same. Rumors softened, whispers became admiration, and the unusual marriage, once a source of scandal, gradually became a story of respect and quiet partnership. Though Edward himself was still adjusting, he began to see that life with Margaret, the woman he had once considered a servant, was neither punishment nor humiliation. It was a journey, and one that was teaching him lessons he had never imagined learning. By the end of Part 2, Edward Harrington had begun to realize that life, guidance, and respect were far more complex than he had ever believed. Margaret Thompson, quietly and patiently, had begun to change him in ways no punishment alone could have accomplished. The young heir, once arrogant and reckless, was slowly learning the true meaning of partnership, responsibility, and humility, lessons that would shape the course of his life in ways he had yet to discover. Months passed, and Edward Harrington began to understand that life with Margaret Thompson was nothing like he had imagined. The initial humiliation he felt had gradually faded, replaced by a cautious curiosity. He could no longer see her simply as a servant, someone beneath him in station. She was competent, intelligent, and remarkably calm in the face of challenges. And while Edward was reluctant to admit it, he began to rely on her guidance more often than he expected. The turning point came one morning when Edward received news that shook him to the core. His father, Lord Benjamin Harrington, had invested heavily in a business venture in the nearby town. At first, the enterprise had shown promise, but a sudden downturn in trade had left the family's finances at risk. Letters from worried associates arrived daily, each carrying news of mounting debts and potential losses. Edward felt panic rising. His reckless youth had never prepared him for a moment like this, and the weight of responsibility now pressed heavily on him. Margaret noticed his growing anxiety. She did not scold him or offer empty reassurances. Instead, she calmly suggested that they review the accounts together. "We need to understand exactly what is happening before we make any decisions," she said. Her tone was firm but gentle, the kind of authority that Edward had begun to respect. Though he felt a twinge of embarrassment at relying on her, he also recognized the truth in her words. For the next several days, Edward and Margaret worked side by side. She explained the details of the business, pointing out areas of potential loss, and suggesting practical steps to mitigate the damage. Edward was surprised by her knowledge. Margaret had no formal training in finance, yet she possessed a sharp mind and a keen ability to organize complex information. She created spreadsheets, calculated expenses, and drafted letters to creditors. Edward watched in awe as she navigated the situation with patience and clarity. At first, Edward tried to assert himself, insisting that he knew how to handle matters. But Margaret would calmly redirect him, asking questions that made him see the gaps in his understanding. Slowly, he began to appreciate her insights. He realized that her calm, methodical approach was exactly what the Harrington family needed in a moment of crisis. The very woman he had once considered beneath him was now guiding him through one of the most challenging times of his life. Word of the family's financial troubles soon spread to the townspeople, who were eager to witness the expected chaos. Many assumed that Edward, the reckless heir, would fail spectacularly, but they were surprised when he began to act differently. Under Margaret's guidance, he wrote letters to creditors with politeness and confidence, negotiated delays, and made practical plans to protect the family's estate. People who had once whispered about his foolishness now whispered about his determination and the strange, capable woman who helped him. Edward found that he was learning more than just business skills. Margaret taught him patience, the importance of listening, and the value of approaching problems calmly rather than rushing headlong into them. He realized that these lessons applied not only to the family's finances but also to his personal growth. He was beginning to see the world differently, understanding that wealth and privilege were meaningless without responsibility, empathy, and careful decision-making. One afternoon, Edward and Margaret visited the town to meet with one of the creditors who had threatened legal action. Edward had dreaded the encounter, imagining angry confrontations and humiliating defeats. But Margaret, ever composed, took the lead. She spoke clearly, explained the family's situation, and proposed a repayment plan that was fair to both sides. Edward watched her in amazement. The creditor, impressed by her intelligence and tact, agreed to the plan without hesitation. Edward felt a surge of gratitude and respect for Margaret that he could not put into words. As the weeks went on, Edward noticed that his feelings toward Margaret were changing in ways he had never expected. He no longer saw her merely as a servant or as part of a punishment imposed by his father. He began to admire her strength, intelligence, and integrity. He found himself seeking her opinion on matters beyond the household, valuing her judgment in ways he had never valued anyone's before. Margaret, for her part, treated him with the same quiet respect she had always shown, never pushing him beyond what he was ready to accept, but allowing him to grow at his own pace. Their partnership began to extend beyond the estate and its business affairs. Edward, who had always lived a life of leisure and indulgence, started participating in community projects, inspired by Margaret's dedication and humility. Together, they organized charitable efforts to help the townspeople affected by recent storms, distributed food to families in need, and supported local schools with supplies and tutoring. Edward felt a sense of purpose he had never known, and he realized that Margaret's influence had changed not only his life, but the way he saw the world around him. Despite the progress he was making, Edward still struggled with moments of pride and insecurity. There were times when he wanted to assert himself, to reclaim the sense of superiority he had once held. But Margaret, always perceptive, had a way of guiding him gently. She never shamed him for his feelings. Instead, she asked questions that encouraged him to reflect, helping him understand the consequences of his actions and the importance of humility. Slowly, Edward learned to temper his pride with wisdom and patience. One evening, as they reviewed the family's finances in the study, Edward looked at Margaret with a new sense of admiration. "I never thought I could depend on anyone like this," he said quietly. "I thought I had to do everything myself, or I would fail." Margaret looked at him calmly, her eyes kind but firm. "No one can face life alone, Edward. Strength comes from understanding, guidance, and cooperation. You have learned to see value where you once overlooked it. That is your true growth." Edward felt a warmth in his chest he had never known. It was not just gratitude, but a deep, unspoken respect for the woman who had quietly changed the course of his life. He realized that Margaret had not only guided him through a financial crisis, but had also taught him about character, integrity, and partnership. The town, which had once expected scandal and failure, began to see the couple differently. Edward and Margaret were no longer subjects of ridicule. They became examples of teamwork, intelligence, and resilience. People marveled at how a young heir and a household servant had turned a potential disaster into an opportunity for growth and respect. Rumors of failure faded, replaced by admiration and, in some cases, envy of the couple's unexpected success. Edward, for his part, was changing in ways he had never imagined. He no longer sought attention or sought to prove himself through reckless stunts. Instead, he focused on understanding, learning, and improving himself. He began to take pride in quiet accomplishments, in the respect of the townspeople, and in the knowledge that he was growing into a responsible man. Margaret, who had never sought recognition, continued to guide him quietly, ensuring that his transformation was genuine and lasting. One afternoon, Edward found himself thinking about how far he had come. He remembered the humiliation he had felt when his father announced the marriage, the whispers of townspeople, and the ridicule he had expected from friends. And now, he realized that the very situation he had once despised had become the most important turning point of his life. Margaret, the woman he had once considered beneath him, had taught him lessons no wealth, power, or privilege ever could. As they walked through the estate gardens together, Edward felt a sense of peace he had never known. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of autumn flowers, and he noticed the care Margaret took in tending the plants, arranging the paths, and keeping the estate in perfect order. He saw not only her skill and intelligence, but also her patience, kindness, and unwavering dedication. I don't think I could have done any of this without you," Edward said quietly, almost to himself. Margaret looked at him calmly, her expression gentle. "You would have found your way eventually, Edward, but we all need guidance. And sometimes, the right person appears in an unexpected place." Edward smiled, feeling a mix of humility, gratitude, and admiration. He realized that his life had been transformed not by punishment alone, but by the presence of someone who challenged him, guided him, and believed in his potential even when he did not believe in it himself. By the end of Part 3, Edward Harrington had truly begun to understand the meaning of partnership. The lessons he had learned from Margaret were not just about finance or responsibility, but about life, character, and the value of seeing people for who they truly are, rather than the roles they occupy. Margaret, quiet and patient, had shown him that respect, patience, and trust were far more powerful than pride or privilege. Together, they had faced challenges, overcome obstacles, and created a partnership that no one had anticipated. One built on mutual respect, intelligence, and the quiet strength of character that neither wealth nor status could define. Edward's transformation was far from complete, but he had crossed a threshold. The reckless, prideful young heir was becoming a thoughtful, responsible man, guided by someone he had once overlooked, someone who had quietly but irrevocably changed the course of his life. And in that change, Edward realized that punishment could sometimes be the most unexpected form of blessing, especially when it came with a teacher as remarkable as Margaret Thompson. The months turned into a full year, and Edward Harrington had changed in ways that surprised even himself. The reckless young heir who had once scorned the idea of responsibility was now someone who approached life with caution, thought, and careful attention. He no longer sought thrill or attention, but rather understanding, learning, and genuine connection. Margaret Thompson, by his side, had become both his guide and his partner in every sense. The estate had begun to flourish under their combined efforts. The business ventures that once threatened the Harrington fortune were now stable. Edward, under Margaret's guidance, had learned to manage accounts, make wise decisions, and plan for the future. The servants, who had once whispered about his arrogance, now looked at him with respect, noticing the subtle changes in his demeanor. Edward was no longer simply a master by birth, he was a leader by his actions. One spring morning, as sunlight streamed through the large windows of the library, Edward found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed. He remembered the humiliation he had felt when his father insisted he marry Margaret, the resentment he had carried in the early days, and the slow, challenging path that had led him here. And yet, as he watched Margaret quietly organizing papers, coordinating household matters, and speaking kindly with the staff, he realized that his life had never been richer. Margaret looked up from her work and smiled at him. "Good morning, Edward. Are you ready for the day?" she asked, her voice calm and steady as always. Edward returned her smile, a genuine one this time. Yes, I am, he said, and I think I finally understand something important. I've spent so much of my life thinking I needed to control everything, to be admired for who I was. But I see now that true respect and true success come from working with others, listening, and learning. Margaret's eyes softened. That is an important lesson, Edward. One that takes many people a lifetime to learn. You are doing well, and you should be proud of the progress you have made. Their partnership extended beyond the estate and business matters. Edward, inspired by Margaret's humility and dedication, began to take a more active role in the town's affairs. Together, they supported local schools, helped families affected by recent storms, and organized community events that brought people together. Edward realized that his influence could be used for good, and Margaret's quiet guidance ensured that he approached these opportunities with thoughtfulness rather than ego. The townspeople, who had once expected scandal and failure, began to see the couple in a new light. They admired the unusual partnership, not just because Edward had changed, but because Margaret's influence had been so transformative. Where whispers of gossip once spread, now stories of respect, courage, and intelligence circulated. People marveled at how a servant and an heir had created something remarkable together, proving that roles and social standing could not define a person's true worth. Edward also began to notice the small, personal changes within himself. He was more patient, more considerate, and more aware of the needs of others. He no longer took pride in reckless actions, but rather in moments of quiet achievement. He found joy in solving problems, helping others, and seeing Margaret's guidance applied successfully. And perhaps most importantly, he had learned humility. One evening, after a long day of organizing a charity event for the town's children, Edward and Margaret walked through the garden. The air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers, and the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. Edward paused and looked at Margaret, feeling a mix of admiration, gratitude, and something deeper he had only recently begun to recognize. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I don't think I ever told you how much I appreciate everything you've done. I know I was foolish at first, but you never gave up on me. You guided me, corrected me, and helped me see what really matters." Margaret smiled, her expression gentle. "Edward, you have grown, not because of me alone, but because you were willing to learn. Guidance is only effective when the person receiving it is ready to change. You have done the work yourself. I merely helped you see what was always possible." Edward shook his head slightly, a smile forming on his lips. "It doesn't feel like just guidance. It feels like partnership. I don't think I ever realized how valuable that is until now." Margaret's smile deepened, but she said nothing. Instead, she linked her arm with his, and together they walked along the garden path, a silent understanding between them. Edward realized that his life had been transformed not only by responsibility, but by someone who cared, who believed in him, and who saw his potential even when he could not see it himself. As the seasons changed, Edward's transformation became visible to everyone around him. He managed the estate with skill and care, making decisions that benefited not just himself, but the staff, the town, and the family legacy. He took pride in his work, not for recognition, but because he genuinely enjoyed contributing to something meaningful. Margaret continued to support him, guiding quietly, correcting when necessary, and celebrating each success without seeking attention. The day finally arrived when Lord Benjamin Harrington returned from a long trip abroad. He had expected to see his son unchanged, perhaps still reckless, perhaps still in need of discipline. Instead, he found a young man transformed. Edward greeted his father calmly, confidently, and with a humility that surprised even the elder Harrington. The estate was orderly, the business stable, and the staff treated with respect and fairness. Margaret, standing quietly beside Edward, radiated calm, competence, and strength. Lord Harrington observed them both, a mix of surprise and pride in his eyes. "I must admit," he said slowly, "I did not expect this. Edward, you have changed. And Margaret, you have done more than I imagined possible. I am impressed." Edward bowed his head slightly, a respectful gesture, and said, "Thank you, Father. I have learned much, and I owe a great deal to Margaret. Without her guidance and patience, I would not be the man I am today." Margaret nodded, modest and composed. "I only helped him see what was already within him," she said quietly. The acknowledgement from his father filled Edward with a sense of accomplishment, but it was nothing compared to the quiet satisfaction he felt in his own heart. He had grown into a man of responsibility, integrity, and thoughtfulness. He had learned the value of partnership, humility, and genuine respect. And he had discovered that true strength often comes from the people who guide and support us quietly, without fanfare or reward. In the following months, Edward and Margaret's relationship deepened. Their bond, initially forged through circumstance, had become one of mutual respect, admiration, and affection. They shared ideas, plans, and challenges openly, working together to manage the estate, assist the town, and build a life that reflected their values. Where once there had been resentment and misunderstanding, now there was trust, collaboration, and a shared sense of purpose. The couple also began to enjoy small, personal joys. They walked together in the garden each morning, shared quiet meals, and found happiness in simple moments that Edward had once overlooked. He noticed the way Margaret's laughter filled the halls, the care she took in every task, and the warmth she brought to everyone she encountered. These details, once invisible to him, now held profound meaning. One evening, as they watched the sun set over the estate, Edward realized something profound. He had been punished by marrying a servant, as his father had insisted. But that punishment had become the greatest gift of his life. It had taught him humility, responsibility, patience, and respect. It had introduced him to someone who saw his potential and guided him toward it. And most importantly, it had shown him that love and admiration could grow in the most unexpected circumstances. Edward turned to Margaret and took her hand gently. "I once thought this marriage would be a punishment," he said softly, "but now I see. It was the beginning of everything I needed to become a better man. Thank you for showing me the way, and for being part of my life in every way." Margaret's eyes softened, and she squeezed his hand. "Edward, life has a way of teaching us lessons we do not expect. You have grown, and together we have built something strong and meaningful. That is the true reward." Edward smiled, feeling a peace and contentment he had never known before. The trials, the embarrassment, the hard lessons, all of it had led to this moment. He had been changed not by punishment alone, but by the presence of someone remarkable, someone patient, wise, and strong. Margaret had been that person, and in doing so, she had transformed not just him, but their life together. By the end of this journey, Edward Harrington had become the man he had always had the potential to be: responsible, thoughtful, and capable of true partnership. Margaret Thompson had proven that strength, intelligence, and kindness could change even the most stubborn heart. Together, they had turned an unexpected marriage into a story of growth, respect, and enduring partnership, a story that no one had anticipated, and one that would be remembered for generations.